For decades, many dog trainers believed in the so-called alpha theory. The idea was simple: dogs, like wolves, were thought to be constantly competing for leadership within the group. So in the human-dog relationship, the owner had to become the stronger alpha and make sure the dog never forgot who was in charge. Under this logic, ordinary dog behavior could suddenly look like a political crisis. If your dog walked through the door before you, ate before you, ignored a command, guarded a toy, or started an interaction on its own, it might be interpreted as a challenge to your authority. Apparently, your Labrador wasn't just being a Labrador. It was staging a coup. This led to training methods designed not simply to teach behavior, but to establish dominance. Owners were told not to let dogs win, and some trainers recommended physical restraint, punishment, or forcing a dog onto its back until it stopped struggling. There is a reason this approach survived for so long: it can look effective. A frightened dog may stop moving. A dog expecting punishment may stop resisting. A dog that has learned that arguing with a human is a terrible career choice may become extremely quiet. But silence isn't the same as understanding, and obedience isn't the same as trust. More importantly, this entire philosophy grew out of a questionable interpretation of wolf behavior. The story begins in 1947, when Swiss zoologist Rudolf Schenkel published an influential study of captive wolves. He observed adult wolves living together under artificial conditions and documented clear patterns of dominance and submission. Some wolves pressured or dominated others, while some showed submissive behavior. From these observations emerged a picture of the wolf pack as a strict hierarchy, with dominant animals at the top. It looked convincing, except for one major problem: a zoo enclosure isn't the wilderness. For more than 20 years, the alpha concept remained mostly inside animal behavior research. Then, in 1970, American wolf biologist L. David Meck published The Wolf: The Ecology and Behavior of an Endangered Species. The book became highly influential and helped introduce the image of the alpha wolf to a much wider audience. The idea had escaped the academic world. Then humans did what humans do best: we took an interesting idea about animals and turned it into advice about ourselves and our pets. The reasoning seemed simple. Wolves live in packs. Dogs descended from wolves. Therefore dogs must also be obsessed with hierarchy. And therefore your dog is probably trying to become the boss. By the late 1970s, dominance-based ideas had entered popular dog training culture, and books such as How to Be Your Dog's Best Friend helped spread confrontational methods associated with dominance thinking. From there, the message became familiar: you must become your dog's alpha. Once you accept that idea, almost every disagreement can be interpreted as a power struggle. Your dog doesn't come when called: challenge. It refuses to give up a toy: challenge. It pulls on the leash, obviously attempting regime change. The training question changes from how do I teach my dog what I want, to how do I prove that I outrank my dog. That is a completely different relationship. Maybe your dog doesn't sit because it is distracted. Maybe it is excited. Maybe the environment is too difficult. Maybe you haven't practiced enough. Or maybe, and this possibility is strangely underrated, your dog simply doesn't understand what you want. Sometimes the student isn't planning a revolution. Sometimes the teacher just hasn't taught the lesson very well. In the alpha framework, even a small mistake can become a tiny constitutional crisis. The biggest problem for the alpha theory was that researchers kept studying wolves, especially wild wolves. Beginning in the 1980s, Meck spent many years observing wild wolves in the Canadian Arctic. These wolves weren't unrelated adults placed together by humans. They were naturally formed groups with family relationships, and the picture looked very different. A typical wild wolf pack wasn't a collection of ambitious strangers constantly fighting for the throne. It was usually a family, a breeding male, a breeding female, and their offspring. The adults guided the group largely because they were the parents, which is considerably less dramatic. Imagine describing your own family by saying, the dominant alpha female has secured control of the household. You mean mom. Meck eventually argued that calling these parents alphas could create the false impression that they had fought their way to the top. But normally, they hadn't conquered the pack. They had produced it. This changes the entire picture. The popular alpha model is often imagined as a pyramid, alpha at the top, beta below, omega at the bottom, everybody permanently monitoring rank. Real wolf packs are far more flexible. Young wolves may eventually leave and form families of their own. Others may stay and help care for younger siblings. Pack size and composition can change depending on food, habitat, mortality, and other environmental conditions. Nature, unfortunately, never received the organizational chart. This doesn't mean wolves never show dominance, submission, aggression, or conflict. They do. But that is very different from saying the normal wolf pack is fundamentally a permanent battle for political power. Wolves have social relationships, they just aren't running a non-stop furry version of Game of Thrones. Social position is often tied to age and family role. Wolves also fight, sometimes violently, but many of the most serious conflicts occur between different packs, especially over territory and resources, rather than because every wolf inside a family wants to replace its parents. Experience can matter enormously too. Older wolves may help a pack not simply because they are physically stronger, but because they have survived long enough to know when to fight, when to retreat, and how to react to danger. In other words, one important form of leadership comes from something surprisingly unglamorous, knowing what you are doing. So why did the early captive wolf studies produce such a different picture? Imagine taking several strong adult wolves that aren't related to each other and placing them together in a limited space. They can't simply leave when relationships become tense. They must share resources and have limited ability to avoid one another. Under those conditions, competition, aggression, dominance, and submission are hardly surprising. The behavior is real. The mistake is assuming that an artificial environment reveals the universal natural structure of wolf society. It is a little like locking a group of unrelated strangers inside one building, controlling their food and personal space, and then announcing that you have discovered the natural social organization of humanity. You haven't discovered humanity. You have discovered what strangers may do when you trap them together. A prison has a hierarchy too. That doesn't make the prison yard the natural model for human family life. Dogs have lived alongside humans for thousands of years and have undergone major behavioral and biological changes through domestication. So when your dog ignores a command, "It is challenging my rank," isn't automatically the best explanation. Maybe the dog is distracted. Maybe it is excited. Maybe the reward isn't valuable enough. Maybe the cue is unclear. Maybe the dog learned the command perfectly in your kitchen but has never practiced it next to 3 squirrels, a bicycle, and half a sandwich lying on the pavement. Your beagle may be difficult, but it is probably not Machiavelli. A more useful question isn't how do I defeat this challenge, but what does my dog understand, and what have I actually trained? That is several layers of assumption before the theory even reaches your living room. One reason dominance-based training can be convincing is that punishment can change behavior very quickly. If an action repeatedly produces an unpleasant consequence, a dog may stop performing that action. So a person may use intimidation or force, see the behavior disappear, and conclude, "See, it worked." But the behavior stopped doesn't tell us what the dog learned. It may have learned the behavior you wanted, or it may simply have learned that mistakes around this person make bad things happen. A frightened dog can look obedient. If you scream at a student every time they answer incorrectly, eventually you may have an extremely quiet classroom. That doesn't automatically make you an excellent teacher. Suppression isn't the same thing as understanding, and fear isn't the same thing as trust. The visible result may look neat while the emotional cost remains completely hidden. Modern training tries to tell those possibilities apart. Modern reward-based training starts from a different question. Not how do I dominate this dog, but how do I make the behavior I want clear, predictable, and worth repeating. If you want a reliable recall, you train recall. If you want loose leash walking, you train loose leash walking. If you want your dog to give up an object safely, you teach a safe exchange. You train the behavior you actually want. You don't need to win a fictional election against your dog first. This doesn't mean dogs should have no rules or boundaries. Reward-based training doesn't mean, my dog destroyed the sofa, but I respect his personal journey. Dogs still need structure, consistency, and clear communication. But structure isn't the same thing as intimidation. You can have standards without making someone afraid of you, and you can guide behavior without turning every mistake into a battle for power. So the real question is not how to become your dog's alpha. It is how to communicate clearly, teach the behavior you want, and build trust. A dog that is afraid of you may look obedient, but fear is not the same as understanding. Good training is not about winning a power struggle. It is about solving the problem, not defeating the dog.